It's time to answer perhaps the most frequently asked question about the Rio Grande Plan. Is the plan set in stone, or can it be modified or adjusted? The Rio Grande Plan is a vision for returning rail service to the Rio Grande Depot in downtown Salt Lake City. This means some sort of grade separation will be necessary, since the old rail right-of-way is now, and always was, a public road. Furthermore, Salt Lake City has needed the benefits of grade separation for a long time, with extra-long freight trains blocking traffic, including pedestrians and emergency vehicles, from moving between neighborhoods, especially east-west. Each of the railroad crossings west of downtown see about 50 trains per day, and when Frontrunner doubles its frequency by the end of the decade, and with the inland port attracting more freight traffic than ever, this number will be closer to 100 trains per day per crossing. The Rio Grande Plan is an opportunity to do 4 things at once. 1. Return rail service to the Rio Grande Depot, giving us one of the grandest train stations in America and a more centralized transit hub worthy of our great city. 2. Grade separate multiple crossings that have become increasingly congested and which have been the locations of multiple fatalities. 3. Relocate the underutilized rail yards and tracks on the west side of downtown into a new corridor, which will open dozens of acres for urban redevelopment. The increased tax revenue from this currently underdeveloped land will be an important source of revenue and could be the location for housing thousands of future Salt Lake City residents. 4. Reconstruct the freeway ramps into shorter, less intrusive structures. Currently, the 3 big bridges on 4th, 5th, and 6th South extend all the way to 5th West, creating an unattractive maze of one-way streets and dead ends. When the railroad tracks are relocated, there will be no need for these bridges to be so long, and we can cut them back to 6th or even 7th West, opening up a total of 12 blocks worth of new street frontage. The bridge at 4th South can be completely removed, creating a seamless surface street from downtown to Poplar Grove and the Jordan River. To achieve these goals, I have pitched the specific solution of burying the rails in a train box below the historic rail corridor of 500 West. In the first Frequently Asked Questions video, I give a detailed explanation of the grades and runout lengths required to achieve this specific vision. In short, the affected area would be between 1300 South, 900 West, and 300 North, with the North Temple Frontrunner station left just how it is now. Let's call this Option 1. In 2023, Salt Lake City published a screening analysis of my original plan, completed by engineering firm Kimley Horn, and this analysis modified the north end of the plan substantially. Instead of ending at 300 North, the plan includes bridges at 300 and 400 North, with the train box finally ending at 500 North. Instead of ending at 900 West, the western extension goes out to 10th West, with bridges at 900 West and 800 West. The original assumed that 800 West could be closed or rerouted instead. This new version of the plan also reconstructed the North Temple Frontrunner station, meaning that there would now be 2 new underground commuter rail stations in Salt Lake City. Obviously, all these add-ons were not cheap, and the price tag came in a lot higher than anything I had been expecting, at $3 to $5 billion. Let's call this version Option 2. In the year since that screening analysis came out, the cost of the expanded project has been the main point of attack against the Rio Grande Plan. There have been other attack routes too, such as by property owners who feel that a large train box under 500 West would negatively impact their existing properties, or that the train box would conflict with plans for the proposed Green Loop Linear Park. And with each of these criticisms, there have been suggestions on how to reduce the costs and impact of the Rio Grande Plan. So, in this Frequently Asked Questions video, let's review 6 more alternative grade separation schemes that have been pitched to me. Since we already have options 1 and 2, let's begin with Option 3, Bury in Place. This option proposes to build the train box, just like options 1 and 2, except this one would be exactly where the tracks are now, and not on 5th West. The benefit is that 5th West is left undisturbed, and the Green Loop project can proceed as planned. While I personally believe that both the Green Loop and the train box can coexist without issue, I do have to admit it will be much easier to build a park with trees and green space when it isn't on the roof of a huge civil infrastructure project. Unfortunately, these are the only 2 benefits to this option, and the downsides are many. The first is that, because the Rio Grande Depot is on 500 West, moving the train box means that rail service could not be restored to the depot, and all the benefits of a closer proximity to downtown, a historic and first-class transit facility, and the activation of the western downtown area would all be forfeited. Essentially, this would no longer be the Rio Grande Plan. While it would be possible to cut back the highway viaducts, as we have proposed, the issue of Salt Lake Central Station being in a non-central location will not be solved. Transit in Salt Lake City will continue to be inaccessible or unappealing for a majority of trips, and our central station design and neighborhood activity will reflect that. Furthermore, this option will probably end up costing even more than the 500 West option. Building a train box underneath an active railroad track is not feasible, so temporary bypasses will need to be constructed and placed in service before construction on the train box can even begin. In Reno, which had a similar issue, this meant a temporary shoe fly constructed in the city streets while their trench was dug out and finished. This will be disruptive and expensive enough for freight trains, but for UTA commuter trains, this will likely mean years of bus bridges around Salt Lake City, their main source of ridership. Freeway commuters would also be subjected to years of delays, as the I-15 bridge at 900 South is not wide enough to accommodate any more than the 3 tracks it spans now. This means that the freeway bridge will need to be completely rebuilt to not only be wide enough for 5 or more tracks, but also have foundations that go deep enough to allow it to span over a below-grade train trench. I could keep going, but I think you get the point. Option 4. Reroute through city blocks to the Rio Grande Depot. This option has the same south end as the previous option, mainly building a below-grade box in place below 900 South and 800 South. All the same problems I mentioned before about shoe flies and freeway bridges still apply. But this time, instead of going straight north to Salt Lake Central Station, this option goes cross-country, purchasing right-of-way through existing blocks to switch over from 600 West to 500 West. Obviously, purchasing new right-of-way creates even more expenses, but this time the plan actually does reach the Rio Grande Depot, so at least we are talking about the Rio Grande Plan again. But what if there was a simpler way to connect to the Rio Grande Depot? Option 5. The Rio Grande Terminal. What if, instead of a through station, we constructed 4 stub-end tracks on 300 South and turned the Rio Grande Depot into the Rio Grande Terminal? After all, 300 South is just as wide as 500 West, so there would be plenty of space for a frontrunner platform and an Amtrak platform, and no space would need to be given to Union Pacific, since they would stay right where they are. This is an idea that was not only pitched but visualized by Yan Ho Ing and Sam Weisler from UVU, which is where we get these beautiful renderings, reminiscent of the old Penn Station in New York City, though the actual design could vary. Now, it's true that rail terminals have significant operational and capacity issues compared to through-running stations. Trains would need to either back into or out of the station, and the junction into the station would be a perpetual choke point, since we need to allow tracks for both frontrunner and Amtrak to cross over each other. However, bigger stations around the world are able to reliably work around similar issues, so we can't rule this design out based just on theory. Denver Union Station, one of the main inspirations for this project, is a good example of a through station that was reduced to a terminal for the sake of development. And while we in Salt Lake City are arguing about costs, Denver's Union Station is completely paid off and turning a profit. And, since the Rio Grande Terminal would be directly adjacent to the main line, a type of through-running service would still be possible on frontrunner. If everything was running on time, the only noticeable difference from today is that your seat would face the opposite way once you pass the Rio Grande Terminal. But it isn't all so straightforward. The curves leading up to the terminal wouldn't be compatible with UTA's current headquarters plans and would require some small amounts of RDA land. Furthermore, because Amtrak requires platforms to be at least 1,000 feet long in order to handle their long-distance trains, the station tracks would need to extend all the way under the historic depot and at least as far as 400 West. That is obviously very expensive, not only because it would require yet another upgrade to the Rio Grande Depot's foundations, but also because it would require the tracks to go even deeper than before just to get completely under those foundations. But there is a silver lining here too. With tracks expanding to the west side, a line up 400 West would be able to deliver passengers directly to the frontrunner and intercity rail platforms on 400 West, which is a level of convenience unmatched by all other versions of the Rio Grande Plan. So, while this option does have some fundamental operational and technical challenges, the high level of convenience and the low level of impact to the Union Pacific Railroad make this an interesting idea. Though I personally do not prefer it, I do think it is worth further consideration. Option 6. Elevate the tracks. Digging below grade can be very complicated and expensive, and dealing with the hidden tangle of utility lines is a time-consuming problem. Why not just go up instead of down? This is what local leaders chose for Spokane, Washington, in preparation for the 1974 World's Expo. Spokane's riverfront, the proposed location of the fair, was a tangle of railroad tracks, passenger depots, and freight yards, similar to our own west side. However, unlike Salt Lake City, Spokane leadership decided to demolish not just one, but two incredible train stations, leaving only the clock tower of the Great Northern Station to remind residents, forever after, of their historic error. Next, all rail traffic was consolidated from the riverfront to the former Northern Pacific alignment and placed onto a new, elevated structure wide enough for 4 tracks and 2 service roads, totaling 85 feet wide. End to end, there are 19 railroad bridges through downtown, and all of them have height restrictions for road vehicles and width restrictions for sidewalks. Efforts to improve these bridges have been entirely superficial, because upgrading to modern standards for height and width would be prohibitively expensive, and the private railroad companies have little interest in community engagement. It is also worth pointing out that when the bridges were built, these were the modern standards for elevated mainline tracks, and they only look uncomfortable to us now because standards have changed. More often, we should ask ourselves, how will the current standards change in another 50 years? Burying the rails will allow the roads above to be continuously updated. Elevating the tracks freezes the infrastructure below them in time. Beyond design considerations, there are the practical engineering problems. Interstate 15 crosses over the tracks just south of downtown, and elevated tracks would either require the tracks to go up even higher than the freeway, or require the freeway to be raised to double height, which would have cascading effects to half the ramps of the 13th South Freeway interchange. A similar conflict exists at the Grants Tower Junction, and the North Temple Viaduct would need to be completely ripped out. And all of this hasn't even touched on the conditions of 500 West, which would somehow have to accommodate up to 6 elevated railroad tracks while still attempting to be an inviting neighborhood street. But what if we don't need to accommodate all 6 tracks? Option 7. Elevate just the passenger trains. What if we leave the freight tracks where they are and elevate just the UTA and Amtrak tracks? After all, Frontrunner can climb steeper grades than freight trains, and already has 2 significant aerial structures as part of its existing route. Amtrak can and does climb grades just as steep as the Frontrunner, so it should be possible to have the tracks ramp down after crossing 100 North, back to street level before the North Temple Viaduct and North Temple Station. With only 3 tracks, 1 for Amtrak and 2 for Frontrunner, the elevated structure would be thin enough to not cover the entire street below. Perhaps just the green loop can go under the structure so as to be sheltered from the sun and snow. The south end, however, has all the same problems as the last option, complete with I-15 being reconstructed across multiple bridges and freeway ramps. That is not a way to reduce costs, and none of this changes the freight situation, since those tracks would remain where they currently are. But I feel like we may be onto something. Let's take this full circle with our final option. Option 8, the 2-phase Rio Grande Plan. Let's take the idea of routing only passenger trains to the Rio Grande Depot and put just those in the train box on 500 West. The freight tracks will be part of a second phase, and will remain just where they are for now. By keeping the freight tracks separate, we are able to significantly reduce the width and depth of the train box. I'm showing 2 tracks for UTA's Frontrunner, space for up to 2 intercity passenger rail tracks, a service access road, and a horizontal utility chase. Whereas the full version of the train box from option 2, the Kimley Horn study, was over 130 feet wide and ran right up against building facades on 500 West, this smaller version of the box would be only 90 feet wide, including this extra space for utility lines. 90 feet is exactly as wide as the current pavement limits, which would not only spare building facades and other private property impacts, it would allow for trees to easily line the street, which is important for things like the Green Loop. Now, I am being a little unfair to option 2. The purpose of that document was never to optimize and reduce impacts. Rather, it was to demonstrate the full functionality of the rail corridor within a new right-of-way. The requirements for the option 2 train box would have gotten smaller during the design process. However, it is doubtful they would have ever gotten below 110 feet wide, and certainly nothing as small as this new option 8. Another way to reduce costs is in structure depth. Since passenger trains are not as tall as a standard double-stack container car, we can save 3 feet of depth here, even with consideration for future electrification. Additional depth can be cut out of the design by giving the utilities a horizontal allotment rather than a vertical one, which will save 8 more feet for a total of 11 feet. This is a big deal because retaining structures get increasingly more expensive the deeper they go. By saving 11 feet over the 2-mile project area between 1300 South and North Temple, 11 feet of wall area on both sides adds up to just over 232,000 square feet of wall area. At $300 per square foot, as used in the Kimley-Horn screening analysis, that would save about $70 million, just in walls. The amount of actual excavation is also reduced, due to both the depth and width reductions, and in this scenario could be reduced by over 28 million cubic feet, for a cost savings of over $425 million. Once we add in the 30% contingency, these 2 reductions alone amount to a savings of about $650 million. And we're only just getting started. Once you cut the spur to the west, including property acquisitions, demolitions, and all the costs of underground construction, then cut out the new North Temple Station, since we can leave the current station just how it is, then cut out the replacement of 2 viaduct approaches that were affected by the wider train box, cut out the replacement I-15 bridge at 500 West, required, again, by the wider train box, reduce the size of the cross-street bridges, and reduce the amount of track, switches, signaling, and construction phasing required by the longer, flatter ramps used by the Union Pacific Railroad, and suddenly we are left with a project that is, at most, in the $1 to $2 billion range, rather than the $3 to $5 billion from option 2. Cutting the price in half like this would be significant enough to completely change the current narrative surrounding the Rio Grande Plan. However, we're only saving on costs at this point because, so far, we haven't done anything to address the freight tracks. Leaving the freight tracks for a future Phase 2 would be understandably disappointing for Westside residents. But it would be good politics if we want to get the Rio Grande Plan completed before the 2034 Winter Olympics. I've been told by multiple well-connected sources that, while the costs are a significant problem on their own, the biggest practical roadblock for the Rio Grande Plan is the involvement of the Union Pacific Railroad. Getting the private railroad company to cooperate and participate in a civic improvement project of this magnitude on this schedule would be unprecedented. Obviously, the Union Pacific Railroad is no stranger to below-grade structures. After all, the Reno Train Trench, which inspired the Rio Grande Plan, is on the same Union Pacific main line that connects through Salt Lake City, and, of course, the Union Pacific has operated through the Alameda Corridor and San Gabriel trenches in California for years without issue. But all 3 of these trenches were built in place, not on a new alignment carved out of city streets. From the railroad's point of view, they would much prefer to have their own facility anyway, not owned by a government agency or shared with public transit. So if we decide to build the Rio Grande Plan in 2 phases, does that mean that we now need 2 expensive train boxes? Well, not necessarily. In certain sections, an enclosed trench with retaining walls would definitely be necessary. The 900 South Bridge is one of those obvious areas, though in this phased option, the freeway bridge does not pose as large an obstacle as the previous bury-in-place options. For one, there would already be a vacated UTA track to use as a shoe-fly while the new structure is constructed. And for 2, the bridge is already wide enough to span 2 or 3 tracks and would not need to be rebuilt, saving hundreds of millions of dollars compared to options 3 and 4. But beyond 900 South, and a few other constricted points, it isn't clear that a full box structure would be needed for most of Phase 2. since there is so much space in the underutilized rail yards, we could make do with slopes rising up from the below-grade tracks, which are significantly less expensive to construct and maintain than vertical walls. In some locations where geometry is a little tighter, gravity walls built on a slope, or even concrete slope protections like you see at freeway interchanges, could be used to lessen the required width far more economically than a vertical structural wall. While the excavation costs will still be large, building this way could turn out to be cheap enough that the combined phases 1 and 2 of the Rio Grande Plan could still end up costing less than the $3 to $5 billion estimated for option 2. Another benefit of the phased approach comes at the station itself, which would no longer need to give valuable space to freight trains. Platforms for Frontrunner and Amtrak could be made extra wide, so that the platforms can work more efficiently and never get crowded. Additionally, passenger trains would never need to tolerate the noise and vibrations and pollution caused by passing freight trains. Similar to Denver Union Station or other station redevelopment projects across the West, freight and passenger trains would remain separate. After all, what is the purpose, really, in having freight trains downtown? How long would it take between Phase 1 and Phase 2? Assuming we were to complete Phase 1 before the 2034 Winter Olympics, it would probably take another decade at least before anyone had the appetite for more grade separations. After all, by burying only the passenger trains, and assuming UTA doubles their frequency in 2030 as planned, we would be directing 75% of trains into the 500 West train box, leaving only a quarter of rail traffic at grade. Ever since Frontrunner began operation, all of the pedestrian incidents and fatalities at these crossings have occurred with Frontrunner trains because they are faster and more frequent. This would be largely eliminated in Phase 1. Furthermore, while freight trains will still continue to pose an inconvenience to West Side residents, they will potentially become less inconvenient with an important change already in the works. The Salt Lake, Garfield, and Western Railroad currently has its main yard near the Jordan River, right about where the Miller Group is proposing their new Major League Baseball stadium to go. Work is already underway to relocate the main yard to a site further west by the inland port. Once this is done, the tracks along South Temple Street will no longer be a location for switching carloads of freight, but will be for through running only. While trains will still be long, they should keep moving. Another source of stopping is switching for the few remaining customers that exist in the 6th West freight yards. I've spoken before about how, with time, most, if not all of these customers will eventually move away on their own, as their property values become too valuable to not cash in on. One of the things holding property values back in this area, besides the highway overpasses, is UTA's current Central Station, which, for the past 25 years, has squandered the economic potential that a city's Central Station should have. By moving to the Rio Grande Depot and making the neighborhood desirable for developers and residents alike, the push to redevelop the rail yards will grow organically, rather than as part of a government mega-project. Once that happens, it is possible that the Union Pacific sells part or all of the 6th West yards all on its own. After all, they've done it before, in places such as the Burnham Yards in Denver, or the land for the Gateway Mall here in Salt Lake City. Overall, I really like option 8, but it isn't my preferred option yet. I would need to have serious assurances that a second phase of grade separation would definitely happen before I could support the phased approach. The purpose of this video is to show that there are many good ideas that have yet to be incorporated into the Rio Grande Plan, and that it is still very much open for public discussion. Perhaps one of these good ideas will come from you. Do you have an option I haven't heard of yet? Is there an option that you prefer? Please let me know in the comments down below. I'm interested to hear your ideas. I'm Christian Lenhart. Thank you for watching.